Some people spend a lifetime chasing love. Others spend a lifetime running from it. Ethan Calloway had chosen the second path long ago. Before the first rooster ever broke the silence of the valley, Ethan was already awake. Dawn spilled across the Wyoming plains like melted copper, brushing the endless grass with quiet fire while the wind carried the familiar scent of dust, leather, and sage. Another day, another fence to mend, another herd to move, another sunrise meant to be survived rather than admired. The ranch had not heard laughter in years. Its weathered barn leaned against the prairie wind with the same stubbornness as the man who owned it. Every board carried scars from harsh winters. Every gate creaked like an old memory refusing to die. Ethan preferred it that way. Empty places asked no questions. Empty places never betrayed anyone. He tightened the saddle, rubbed the neck of his aging horse, and reached for the rope hanging beside the stable door. That was when he saw her again, standing beyond the split-rail fence, exactly where she had stood yesterday, and the day before that. An Apache woman wrapped in a dark buckskin dress embroidered with faded turquoise beads remained perfectly still beneath the rising sun. Her long black hair moved gently with the breeze while her calm brown eyes rested on him without hesitation, without fear, without demand. She did not wave. She did not smile. She simply watched. Ethan let out a tired breath. "Go home," he muttered, hardly loud enough for anyone to hear. She remained where she was. The silence stretched between them, broken only by distant cattle and the lonely cry of a hawk circling above the canyon. He returned to his work. By noon the heat settled over the ranch like a heavy blanket. Sweat darkened his shirt, dust clung to his boots, and every muscle protested with the dull ache of a man who had carried too many burdens for too many years. When he finally looked toward the fence again, she was gone. No footprints, no horse, nothing except a small bundle resting on the fence post. Inside lay fresh bread still warm from the morning fire, dried venison wrapped in clean cloth, and several sprigs of mountain herbs tied together with red thread. No note, no explanation. Ethan stared for a long moment before shaking his head. He picked up the bundle, walked straight to the edge of the pasture, and placed it beneath an old cottonwood where hungry travelers sometimes rested. "If somebody wants it," he whispered, "they can have it." The next morning she returned. The morning after that, she returned again, sometimes with water gathered from the spring, sometimes with herbs, sometimes with nothing at all except those patient eyes that seemed to know something he did not. The people in Dry Creek began to notice. Old Mrs. Hargrove crossed herself whenever the woman appeared. Children whispered behind wagon wheels. Men at the general store exchanged uneasy glances before lowering their voices. "That Apache girl keeps coming back. She wants something, or she's waiting for something." Ethan ignored every rumor. He had buried enough ghosts without digging up new ones. But on the 30th sunrise, exhaustion finally outweighed patience. As he stepped onto the porch with dark circles beneath his eyes and another endless day's work waiting beyond the fields, he found her standing in exactly the same place once more. This time, before she could quietly turn away like always, Ethan walked toward the fence. For the first time in 30 mornings, the distance between them began to disappear. The distance between two people is rarely measured in footsteps. More often, it is measured by the fears neither of them is willing to speak aloud. Ethan stopped a few feet from the fence, the morning breeze tugging gently at the brim of his worn hat. Up close, the Apache woman looked different from what the frightened gossip in Dry Creek had painted in his mind. There was no trace of anger in her face. No challenge. No plea. Only quiet patience that seemed strangely untouched by time. For several long moments, neither of them spoke. The prairie breathed around them. A meadowlark sang somewhere beyond the creek. His old horse snorted softly behind the barn. "You've been standing here every morning," Ethan finally said, his voice rough from years of speaking more to cattle than people. "Why?" The woman lowered her eyes for only a heartbeat before meeting his gaze again. "I wanted to see if you were still alive." The answer caught him off guard. He frowned. "Seems like an odd reason." "It is enough for me." Silence returned. She untied a small leather pouch hanging from her belt and carefully placed it on the top rail of the fence. "Your shoulder still hurts." Ethan's expression hardened. "How would you know that?" "You lift your right arm slower every morning." He instinctively glanced toward his shoulder before realizing what he had done. The ache had started after a wild stallion threw him onto frozen ground the previous winter. He had never mentioned it to anyone. There was no one to tell. She gave a small nod toward the pouch. Willow bark. He did not move. It eases pain. I don't need charity. It isn't charity. What is it then? A gift. He looked at the bundle as though it might bite him. My father used to say nothing comes free on the frontier. A faint smile touched her lips. My grandmother taught me something different. Again, neither of them moved. Finally, Ethan reached for the leather pouch. Without opening it, he placed it back onto the fence. You should take it home. She didn't. Instead, she simply inclined her head with quiet understanding, picked up the pouch, and turned toward the hills. Her footsteps were almost soundless against the dry grass. She never looked back. For reasons Ethan could not explain, watching her leave felt heavier than watching her arrive. The following morning she appeared again, this time carrying a small clay jug filled with cool spring water. He refused it. The next day, she brought smoked trout wrapped in broad leaves. He refused that too. 3 mornings later, she left fresh sage beside the gate before disappearing into the mist. He ignored it until evening, when he quietly gathered the herbs before an unexpected storm soaked the valley. Days became a strange rhythm neither of them acknowledged. She arrived with the sunrise. He pretended not to expect her. She never asked questions. He never thanked her. Yet every morning his eyes drifted toward the fence before they looked anywhere else. The townspeople noticed far more than they should have. Inside Hargrove's general store, whispers followed Ethan wherever he walked. That Apache woman still visiting? Maybe she put some kind of spell on him. My cousin says warriors scout ranches this way. Old Sheriff Boone merely stirred his coffee without joining the conversation. He had lived long enough to know that fear usually spoke louder than truth. Ethan paid for his supplies and left without answering a single rumor. By the time he reached his ranch, the sun was sinking behind the distant ridges, washing the plains in deep amber light. Something caught his attention beside the front porch. Another gift. Not food. Not herbs. A neatly folded wool blanket. Resting on top of it was a single eagle feather tied with blue thread. For the first time since she began appearing at his fence, Ethan did not ask himself why she kept coming. Instead, one unsettling question settled quietly into his weary heart. How did she always know exactly what he needed before he did? Sometimes absence speaks louder than 1,000 quiet visits. It is only when a familiar shadow disappears that the heart realizes it had been waiting all along. The 31st sunrise came wrapped in silver mist. Ethan stepped onto the porch before he had even poured his coffee. The habit surprised him the moment he caught himself looking toward the old fence instead of the horizon. Morning dew rested on the weathered rails, turning each drop into a tiny piece of glass beneath the rising sun. The fence was empty. He stood there for another minute. Then another. The prairie stretched endlessly beneath the pale sky, but there was no dark buckskin dress, no quiet figure, no calm eyes watching him from across the pasture. Only wind. He shook his head with a quiet laugh. What did you expect? The words sounded convincing. His heart did not believe them. He spent the morning repairing a broken section of corral that had waited nearly a week for attention. Usually the steady rhythm of hammer against would help silence unnecessary thoughts. Not today. Every few minutes, his eyes wandered toward the distant trail leading out of the hills. Nothing. By midday, the Wyoming sun hung high overhead, filling the valley with shimmering heat. The scent of dry grass drifted across the ranch, while grasshoppers chirped lazily beneath the fence posts. Still no sign of her. For the first time in years, Ethan finished his work early. He sat beneath the old cottonwood, where she had once left warm bread for strangers instead of for him. The eagle feather she had delivered days before rested inside his coat pocket without him remembering when he had placed it there. He slowly turned it between his fingers. Blue thread. Perfectly tied. Something about it felt older than the gift itself. Sheriff Boone happened to ride past the ranch that afternoon. The old lawman slowed his horse. Haven't seen your visitor today. Ethan looked away. I hadn't noticed. Boone chuckled softly, the wrinkles around his eyes deepening beneath the brim of his faded hat. Son, a lonely man notices more than he admits. Before Ethan could answer, the sheriff tipped his hat and continued down the dusty road. The words lingered long after the hoofbeats disappeared. That evening Dry Creek buzzed with its usual collection of rumors. Someone claimed an Apache camp had moved farther west. Someone else insisted soldiers had been spotted near the canyon. Mrs. Hargrove whispered that perhaps the young woman had finally accepted she wasn't welcome among white ranchers. Ethan remained unusually quiet throughout supper at the boarding house. He barely touched the stew. On his way home, he found himself stopping at the ridge overlooking the valley. From there he could see miles of rolling prairie fading into distant mountains painted purple by the setting sun. It was beautiful. It was painfully empty. The following morning he awoke before dawn. Again, the fence stood deserted. A strange weight settled across his chest. He no longer wondered why she kept coming. Now he wondered why she had stopped. Without allowing himself time to reconsider, Ethan saddled his horse. He packed a canteen, a bedroll, and enough provisions for 2 days. If anyone asked, he would say he was checking lost cattle near the canyon. Even he knew that was a lie. The narrow trail climbed steadily toward the Apache hunting grounds, weaving through towering pines and scattered boulders where the morning light barely reached. Fresh hoofprints marked the soft earth, smaller than his horse's, only a few hours old. Ethan slid from the saddle and knelt beside them. There, pressed gently into the damp soil beside the tracks, lay something that made his pulse quicken. A single turquoise bead, the same color stitched into the woman's buckskin dress. He closed his fingers around the tiny stone. For the first time since she had appeared outside his ranch, Ethan was no longer waiting for her to come. He was following her into a world he had spent his entire life avoiding. The frontier has a way of hiding its greatest truths in the places most people are too afraid to enter. The trail narrowed as Ethan guided his horse deeper into the foothills. Towering ponderosa pines blocked the morning sun, filling the forest with cool shadows and the earthy scent of damp soil. Every sound seemed sharper beneath the trees, the distant tapping of a woodpecker, the whisper of wind through pine needles, the steady rhythm of his horse's breathing. The turquoise bead remained tucked safely inside his pocket. It was the only proof he had that he was following the right path. Hours passed without another sign. Then his horse suddenly stopped. Its ears stood forward. Its muscles tightened. Ethan followed its gaze. Fresh hoofprints crossed the trail. Smaller tracks surrounded them. Children. He slid quietly from the saddle, tying the reins loosely to a low branch before continuing on foot. His boots pressed softly into the forest floor, careful not to disturb the silence. As he climbed over a ridge of weathered stone, voices drifted through the trees. Children laughing. Not shouting. Laughing. He eased forward until the forest opened into a hidden meadow. The sight before him stole the breath from his lungs. Nearly a dozen Apache children chased one another through tall grass, glowing beneath the afternoon sun. A pair of elderly women sat weaving baskets beneath a cottonwood tree, while smoke curled gently from several cooking fires nearby. Horses grazed peacefully along the edge of the clearing. There were no warriors preparing for battle. No frightened prisoners. No signs of the danger the town had described. Only families. Only life. Then he saw her. Nayeli knelt beside a little boy whose scraped knee was streaked with dirt and blood. She carefully cleaned the wound with water before wrapping it in strips of clean cloth. The frightened child stopped crying the moment she smiled at him. Another little girl ran into her arms carrying a bundle of wildflowers. Nayeli laughed softly. The sound surprised Ethan more than anything else. He had heard only silence from her. Now he realized silence had never been emptiness. It had simply been peace. Without warning, a dry branch cracked beneath Ethan's boot. Every head turned. The laughter vanished. Several older boys instinctively stepped in front of the younger children. Within seconds, 2 Apache men emerged from the trees carrying bows, their movements calm rather than aggressive. One raised a hand. "Do not move." Ethan slowly lifted both palms. "I didn't come to fight." The older of the 2 warriors studied him for a long moment before shifting his eyes toward Nayeli. She had already risen to her feet. For the first time since Ethan had known her, surprise crossed her face. "You followed me. I was looking for answers." She glanced at the turquoise bead peeking from his closed fist. "You found one." The older warrior waited for her response. She spoke quietly in Apache. His stern expression softened almost immediately. The bow lowered. The tension dissolved as quickly as it had appeared. To Ethan's astonishment, several children stepped out from behind the adults and stared at him with open curiosity rather than fear. One little boy tugged gently on Nayeli's sleeve. Is this the lonely rancher? She smiled without taking her eyes off Ethan. Yes. The child grinned. He looks sadder than you described. A ripple of gentle laughter spread through the meadow. Even Ethan found himself unable to hide the corner of a smile. Then his eyes wandered beyond the camp. At the far edge of the clearing, hidden beneath a grove of ancient cottonwoods, stood something that made his smile slowly disappear. A weathered wooden cross. Fresh flowers rested at its base. Someone had been visiting that grave very recently, and for reasons he could not yet explain, Ethan felt certain that the grave had something to do with him. The smallest objects often carry the heaviest memories. A single flower on a forgotten grave can tell a story that no living voice has the strength to repeat. Ethan could not take his eyes off the weathered wooden cross. It stood alone beneath the cottonwoods where sunlight filtered softly through trembling leaves. Wildflowers had been arranged with quiet care around its base, their fresh petals untouched by dust. Someone had visited that place only hours before. Without thinking, Ethan stepped toward it. Nayeli gently caught his sleeve. Walk softly. Her voice was calm. They are listening. He glanced around the peaceful meadow. I don't see anyone. You don't have to. She released his arm. Together they crossed the short distance to the grave while the laughter of children faded respectfully behind them. The cross bore no family name. Only 3 carefully carved words. Thomas Calloway. Ethan's breath caught. His father. His knees weakened beneath him. No. He knelt in the grass, brushing trembling fingers across the faded letters as though the wood itself might deny what his eyes had already seen. My father never died here. His voice sounded distant, almost unfamiliar. The army said he was buried near Fort Laramie. No one answered immediately. The wind moved gently through the cottonwood branches overhead. Finally, Nayeli spoke. They were mistaken. Ethan slowly turned toward her. My father never told me he knew your people. He knew my grandfather. The words settled between them like falling snow. She reached into a small leather satchel hanging at her side and carefully withdrew an old silver pocket watch. Time had darkened its surface, but the engraved initials remained clear. T.C. Ethan stared at it in disbelief. He recognized the watch instantly. His father had carried it every day of his life. After Thomas disappeared during a supply journey nearly 20 years earlier, the watch had never been found. With both hands, Nayeli placed it gently into Ethan's open palm. He asked us to keep it safe. Ethan could barely breathe. What happened? Nayeli lowered herself beside the grave. My grandfather told me this story many times. Her eyes drifted toward the distant mountains as though watching another lifetime unfold. Your father found our people during a winter blizzard. Our camp had little food. Several children were dying. He had one wagon filled with supplies meant for the army. Ethan listened without moving. He gave us nearly everything. Blankets, flour, medicine. He said hungry children mattered more than soldiers with full stomachs. The silence that followed seemed endless. What happened to him? He became sick. Very sick. Our healers tried. My grandfather stayed beside him every night. But the fever was stronger. Nayeli looked toward the wooden cross. He asked not to be buried alone. So my people buried him here, where children could always laugh nearby. Tears blurred Ethan's vision. His father had never spoken with hatred about the Apache. Not once. Even when everyone else had. As a boy, Ethan had assumed it was simply kindness. Now he understood. His father had carried a secret gratitude to his grave. Nayeli gently picked up a small object resting beside the flowers. It was another turquoise bead. She smiled sadly. When I was little, my grandfather brought me here. He told me about the white rancher who saved our people. He said that if his family ever needed us, our family would never turn away. She looked directly into Ethan's eyes. That is why I came to your fence every morning. It was never because you owed us. It was because your father once taught us what true honor looked like. Ethan closed his fingers around the old pocket watch. For the first time since losing his father, the emptiness inside him felt different. Not smaller, but no longer alone. Then, from somewhere beyond the meadow, a distant horse whinnied sharply. One of the Apache scouts hurried into the clearing, his face unusually tense. He spoke quickly in his own language. The warmth disappeared from every face around the camp. Nayeli rose. At once. When she turned back toward Ethan, the sorrow in her eyes had been replaced by quiet urgency. They've come. They finally found our camp. Fear spreads across a frontier faster than fire. But it takes only one quiet truth to expose every lie that came before it. The camp transformed in moments. Children disappeared into the safety of the lodges. The older women gathered blankets and supplies with practiced calm. Warriors moved silently between the trees, not with panic, but with the discipline of people who had survived too many false alarms to waste a single motion. Ethan instinctively reached for the revolver resting against his hip. Nayeli noticed. Guns will only make frightened men feel justified. He looked toward the ridge where the scout had pointed. How many? We don't know. The older warrior stepped beside them. His name, Ethan would later learn, was Dakota. Deep lines marked his face like old riverbeds carved by time. He carried his bow with confidence, yet his eyes held no hunger for violence. Dakota spoke quietly. We have watched your ranch for many months. Ethan frowned. My ranch. The old warrior nodded. Not to threaten you. To protect you. Before Ethan could answer, Dakota pointed toward the valley below. You remember the cattle thieves last autumn? Ethan remembered all too well. Nearly 30 head had vanished overnight from neighboring ranches. Only his herd had remained untouched. I was lucky. Dakota slowly shook his head. No. He gestured toward several young Apache riders standing nearby. They followed the thieves. They turned them away before they reached your land. Ethan stared at him. Why? Dakota answered without hesitation. Because your father's kindness became our promise. Another memory surfaced. The broken fence repaired one morning before Ethan had even noticed it. The wolves that circled his calves during winter but never attacked. The strange hoofprints he occasionally found around his property after storms. None of it had been chance. Someone had been watching over him all along. Not out of obligation. Out of gratitude. His chest tightened. All those lonely years, he had never truly been alone. A sharp whistle echoed through the trees. Another scout galloped into the clearing, breathing hard. This time, Ethan understood enough from the expressions around him. The danger was real. Dakota turned toward Nayeli. They're settlers. From Dry Creek. They're armed. Ethan's heart sank. Dry Creek. His own town. He already knew how quickly fear could turn ordinary men into something unrecognizable. I have to go. Nayeli stepped into his path. They won't listen. They might listen to me. They're afraid. They're my neighbors. She searched his face for a long moment. Sometimes neighbors become strangers before strangers become family. The words landed with painful honesty. Ethan lowered his eyes. She was right. The people of Dry Creek had spent years judging a camp they had never seen, while the Apache had spent those same years quietly protecting a man who never knew they were there. Nayeli reached into her medicine pouch and removed a small braided bracelet woven from blue thread and narrow strips of soft leather. A single silver charm rested at its center. She carefully wrapped it around Ethan's wrist. My grandfather made this. He looked at the bracelet. I can't take it. You already have. He looked back at her. What if they're right? She tilted her head. About what? What if bringing our worlds together only makes both of them suffer? For the first time since they had met, sadness filled her gentle smile. I never came to your fence hoping you would repay an old debt. She paused as the wind stirred loose strands of her dark hair. I came because every morning I wanted to know the son of Thomas Calloway was still alive. Her voice grew quieter. And because, after many years, I hoped one day you would stop seeing an Apache woman standing outside your fence. And finally see me. The words settled between them more heavily than any confession either of them had expected. Before Ethan could answer, a distant rifle cracked across the valley. Then another. The silence of the frontier had finally been broken. Hatred rarely arrives wearing the face of evil. More often, it rides beside ordinary men who believe they are doing what is right. Another rifle shot echoed across the valley. This one was closer. Birds burst from the pine trees, scattering into the pale afternoon sky. Dakota motioned for everyone to remain hidden. The Apache camp obeyed without panic. Mothers gathered frightened children into the lodges while older boys carried buckets of water away from the open fires, making certain no smoke would reveal their position. No one shouted. No one ran. They had practiced this silence too many times. Ethan climbed beside Dakota onto a rocky overlook that faced the narrow trail winding through the canyon below. Dust rose in the distance. Within moments, riders came into view. 8 of them, armed. The lead rider wore a familiar brown hat. Deputy Collins. Behind him rode 3 ranchers from Dry Creek, including Jacob Mercer, a man whose cattle Ethan had helped rescue only months before. The remaining riders carried repeating rifles across their saddles, scanning the forest with nervous eyes. Ethan's stomach tightened. These were not bad men. They were frightened men. Sometimes the difference disappeared too quickly. "They've tracked us," one young Apache whispered. Dakota quietly shook his head. "They're tracking fear." The words lingered in Ethan's mind. Deputy Collins raised a hand, signaling his group to stop near the creek. "They're close," he shouted. "I found fresh tracks." One rancher spat into the dust. "They've probably stolen livestock again." Another gripped his rifle tighter. "My wife says they poisoned the wells." Ethan closed his eyes. Neither accusation was true. He knew that now. Yet he remembered hearing those very rumors inside Hargrove's store. Rumors had become certainty. Certainty had become armed men. Without another thought, Ethan started down the slope. Nayeli caught his wrist. "If they see you leaving our camp, they'll think exactly what they've already decided to believe." He looked into her eyes. "If I stay here, they'll never have the chance to believe anything else." She slowly released him. Dakota stepped forward. "You carry your father's heart." Ethan managed a weary smile. "I only hope I carry enough of his courage." He descended toward the trail alone. The crunch of gravel beneath his boots caught the attention of every rider below. 8 rifles swung toward him instantly. Deputy Collins blinked in surprise. "Ethan, what in God's name are you doing up there?" Ethan continued walking until he stood halfway between both sides. Behind him lay the hidden Apache camp. Ahead waited his own neighbors. He belonged to both worlds. And suddenly, to neither. Jacob Mercer pointed toward the trees. "They got you too?" "No. They saved me." The ranchers exchanged uneasy glances. Deputy Collins frowned. "Step aside. We're taking care of this." "No." The single word settled heavily over the canyon. Collins stared at him. "Move." Ethan remained still. "You don't know who's behind those trees." "I do. They're hiding warriors. They're hiding children. They murdered settlers. They buried my father." Silence. Every face hardened. Collins slowly nodded. "So it's true. They killed Thomas Calloway." Ethan quietly removed the silver pocket watch from his coat. He held it toward them where the afternoon sun caught its worn surface. "They buried him with honor. He died after saving their children." No one spoke. The wind carried only the creak of leather saddles and the distant rustling of pine branches. Jacob Mercer laughed nervously. "They filled your head with stories." Ethan looked directly at him. "Who filled yours?" The question landed harder than any accusation. Mercer opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Behind Ethan, unseen by the settlers, Nayeli watched from the edge of the forest. She did not carry a weapon, only hope. Then Deputy Collins slowly cocked the hammer of his rifle. His voice came low. "Ethan, don't make me choose between my orders and our friendship." The canyon fell completely silent. Even the wind seemed to stop and wait for Ethan's answer. The strongest man in the West is not the one who draws first. It is the one who knows exactly when not to. Deputy Collins kept his rifle leveled at Ethan. Neither man moved. The canyon seemed to hold its breath. Behind the trees, Apache families waited in absolute silence. Ahead, 8 settlers sat stiffly in their saddles, fingers resting uneasily against polished rifle stocks. Only the wind dared to move. "Ethan," Collins said quietly, "step away." "I can't. You'll force our hand." "You already believe your hands are forced." The deputy's jaw tightened. "We received reports." "From who?" No one could answer. "They said Apache warriors were gathering." "They are." Collins blinked. Ethan continued before anyone could speak. "They're gathering around frightened children. They're gathering around old women. They're gathering around the grave of my father." Jacob Mercer scoffed. "You expect us to believe that?" Ethan slowly reached toward his holster. Every rifle rose another inch. Nayeli instinctively took one step forward from the trees. Dakota gently stopped her with one weathered hand. "This is his path." Instead of drawing his revolver, Ethan unbuckled the entire gun belt. Leather creaked softly. The silver buckle flashed once beneath the afternoon sun. Then he laid the revolver on the dusty ground between both sides. The sound was surprisingly small, yet it echoed louder than the rifle shots that had brought everyone there. No one spoke. Ethan took another step forward. Then another. His empty hands remained where everyone could see them. If you truly believe they're murderers, then shoot me first. Shock rippled across the settlers. Collins lowered his rifle only slightly. What are you doing? I'm standing where my father would have stood. He pointed toward the hidden camp. My father gave those people food when his own army needed it. They repaid him by protecting his son for 20 years. He turned slowly, allowing every rider to hear each word. They repaired my fences. They drove away cattle thieves. They watched over my ranch. And I never even thanked them. Jacob Mercer looked uncertain now. The thieves. You never found them. No. Because Apache riders chased them away. Silence spread across the canyon. One by one, doubt replaced certainty. An older rancher shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. My grandson got lost near Black Creek last winter. Dakota stepped from the trees. Without carrying a weapon. It was our hunters who led him home. The old rancher's eyes widened. You? Dakota simply nodded. We did not tell you. Good deeds lose their meaning when they ask for applause. The words drifted through the canyon like falling leaves. One rifle slowly lowered. Then another. Then another. Collins looked around at the men beside him. Fear was leaving them. Without fear, anger suddenly looked much smaller. At that moment, Nayeli quietly stepped from the shelter of the pines. She carried nothing in her hands. No knife. No bow. Only the wildflowers she had gathered earlier for Thomas Calloway's grave. She walked past Dakota, past Ethan, until she stood beside the revolver lying in the dust. She never looked at the weapon. Instead, she knelt. She picked up the flowers that had slipped from her hands during the commotion. She brushed the dust from their petals. Then she stood again. Such a simple act. Such an ordinary act. Yet every man watching understood something without anyone saying it aloud. The woman they had ridden here to fear had stopped to save flowers before thinking of herself. Ethan looked at her. She looked back. No words passed between them. None were needed. Very slowly, Ethan reached out his empty hand. For one long heartbeat, the entire frontier seemed balanced upon that single gesture. Nayeli looked at the waiting settlers. Then at Dakota. Finally, she placed her hand in Ethan's. Neither of them smiled. Some moments are too sacred for smiles. Deputy Collins exhaled deeply. The sound carried farther than any command. He uncocked his rifle, then lowered it completely. One after another, the remaining settlers did the same. No treaty had been signed. No battle had been won. Only one frightened decision had been replaced by one courageous one. And somehow, that was enough. Edit. Years pass quietly on the frontier. The dust forgets footprints. The wind carries away old gunfire. But kindness has a strange way of leaving tracks that time itself cannot erase. 23 years later, travelers still stopped at the little ranch beneath the cottonwoods. The fences were weathered. The barn leaned slightly against the western wind. The porch creaked with every change of season. Yet people came from miles away. Not because it was rich, not because it was famous, but because every thirsty rider found water waiting beside the gate. Every hungry stranger found bread cooling on the kitchen table. No one was ever asked where they came from, only whether they had eaten. An old wooden sign stood near the entrance. It carried no family name. Only a single sentence burned carefully into the timber. Leave fear outside this gate. Children often laughed beneath the cottonwood trees. Some had Apache names. Some had settler names. None of them seemed to notice the difference. To them, stories mattered more than blood. On quiet evenings, Ethan would sit on the porch while Nayeli worked beside the garden, humming songs her grandfather had once sung beneath the mountains. The silver pocket watch rested safely inside the house beside Thomas Calloway's faded photograph. Around Ethan's wrist remained the old braided bracelet she had tied there so many years before. Time had worn the leather smooth, but he never removed it. One autumn afternoon, a young traveler arrived leading a tired horse. He looked no older than 20. His coat was dusty. His eyes carried the same loneliness Ethan had once hidden from the world. The young man hesitated outside the gate. I can pay. Ethan smiled softly. You don't have to. The traveler looked confused. Why? Ethan handed him a cup of cool water. Because someone once fed my father. The young man drank in silence.